anyone with us tonight who isn't familiar with the Arboretum, I'd like to encourage you to visit us and become members to support our work and support programs like this one. If you'd like to join us, I brought some membership forms and left them on the table. If you don't know where to find us, we have a website called Croton-Arboretum.org that has maps and driving directions. Moving right to tonight's event, our speaker is author and landscape architect Carolyn Summers. With more than 15 years in the field, Carolyn's work includes nonprofit and government agencies, including the National Resources Defense Council, the Trust for Public Land, New York City's Department of Environmental Protection, for which she researched and implemented a plant indigenous-only policy for New York City's environmental construction programs. Her projects include an urban wildlife refuge, building a watershed forestry coalition, and an analysis and critique of the New York-New Jersey metro region's environmental programs. And I'll bet that was pretty lively. Her most recent book is Designing Gardens with Flora of the American East, and I believe she's brought a flyer for anyone who would like to see how to get the book. I should mention also that she's an adjunct professor at Westchester Community College and a technical advisor to the Native Plant Center, which is where I found her. Tonight, however, Carolyn brings an ecological design perspective to bear on residential landscapes. How can indigenous plants help our gardens support a healthy, biodiverse landscape? Can we substitute indigenous plants for those invasives we hate to love? How can we use indigenous plants to design gardens with traditional or even formal styles, as well as naturalistic or wild gardens? So now, without further ado, I turn you over to Carolyn.
Thank you, Karen. I just want to say a little more things about my background, which is that when I became a landscape architect, when I went to school to become a landscape architect, my thinking was that I was going to take human-dominated landscapes and make them more wildlife friendly. That was my goal. And not that aesthetics weren't a consideration, but my overriding goal was to make wildlife friendly habitats in human-dominated areas. One of the first things that I learned, I went to CCNY, which is City College of New York, and it's a very urban sort of mentality, but even so, even within that mentality, quickly we all learned that native plants are the best way to go if what you're interested in is bringing in the wildlife. How many of you have heard Douglas Ptolemy speak? Douglas Ptolemy wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home. Any of you familiar with it or have heard him speak? He does occasionally make it up into our region. He's a professor at the University of Delaware, and he is a wonderful, wonderful speaker. And he's an entomologist. He's not a landscape architect. He'll be the first person to tell you that he's just learning about plants, but he has been able to write a book that really brings home the whole idea of the food web, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that here today as an intro to my other part of the design talk that I want to give. First, I just want to say a few words about the Native Plant Center, which has already been mentioned. That's where I do a lot of my volunteer work. We have a program called Go Native U, and we have people who are taking the certificate course. There's someone here tonight, I think, who's involved in the certificate course. And we actually have a certificate that we're giving in native plant studies. And you can take all the classes at the Westchester Community College. And we've only just started, so we're still working the bugs out. But I think it's going to be a very successful program, and we've already got between 30 and 40 people enrolled in the program, which is really great for something that's just starting out. So if you're interested, you can go to the Native Plant Center's website, or you can also go to the Westchester Community College's website. And one more thing I'll just say about the Native Plant Center is that we've been involved with the county on a lot of joint efforts. And in fact, the Native Plant brochure was a joint project between us and the county. And if the county doesn't have them, sometimes you can still get that brochure from the Native Plant Center. I also brought some copies of some suggested plant lists. So we're full of plant lists tonight. I hope there were enough copies for everybody. If not, you can talk to me afterwards and I can get you copies of any of the materials that we ran out of. So let's start by getting our vocabulary straight and making sure we're all on the same page and that we all know what we're talking about, which is what is an indigenous or native plant. When I say that something has evolved over millennia, I really do mean millennia, as opposed to the 500 or 600 years that some plants have been here that were brought by the first European colonists. And there's various back and forth as to how long some of these plants have been here and how long, in fact, the Europeans have been coming to this continent. Some people say it's longer than that. But in any case, plants that have been here for just a few hundred years are only naturalized. We call that naturalized. It's not the same as native. It's not the same as having evolved together with the fauna together over millions of years, thousands and millions of years. So they grow without cultivation, which is also true, as we will see, of invasive exotic plants, but the natives have been here all along. The term native plant also requires a qualifier. If we talk about the native plants of the United States or the native plants of North America, which people frequently do, it's not as precise as what we need to think about if we're really thinking about the ecological connections and if we're really thinking about the food web and how wildlife interacts with our plants. And I'm going to talk really quickly about some of that before we talk about design, because I think it helps to understand why we want to use the native plants. And this is the heart of it, is to reconnect with this web of life, the food web. When I say that it's providing the only food and best shelter for most wildlife, that's not an overstatement, and I'll explain it as we go on. Less maintenance. These are not super plants. If you plant native plants as baby plants, you need to give them the same amount of attention that you would any other small plant that you're just getting started. They're going to need water. Definitely they're going to need water, but what they don't need is fertilizer. So from the point of view of most native plants, they don't even like fertilizer. Some of them you can kill them with fertilizer. So that is less maintenance right there. And the last bullet, prevent the accidental releases of alien pathogens, insects, and other plants. One could do a whole talk just on that one problem. And we as gardeners, really, in the past, we didn't really know some of what we were doing, and a lot of it was accidental and unintentional. And even some of the botanical gardens, were unintentionally responsible for releasing some very bad plants and some very bad pathogens. But now we know better. As gardeners, we know better, and we have to take responsibility for bringing in any new and undesirable aliens. And it's just something to be aware of as a consumer when you go to a nursery. Think about what you're buying and think about whether this plant has really been adequately trialed, because there is nothing to prevent any nursery from bringing in anything from around the world, and we have no adequate safeguards at our borders for bringing in diseases and even insects. So one of the most interesting things about this is the connection between host plants and insects. And of course, the poster child for this is the monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies have got great PR people out there working for them. By now, everybody knows that monarchs travel to Mexico. They make this incredible journey. They fly down there in the fall, and they spent the winter in Mexico, which we all wish we could do. But if we were going to spend the winter in Mexico, we wouldn't pick those high alpine forests with the pine trees and the snow, which is where the butterflies seem to like it the best. Go figure. So the butterflies then come back, and what some people may not know is that it's not the same butterflies that you see coming back. It's actually several generations removed. The butterflies that winter over in Mexico can make it back only as far as the southwestern United States, southern and southwestern. And at that point, they have to find their host plant. And we all know, because the PR for monarchs is so good, that it's milkweeds. Every monarch butterfly needs to find milkweeds to lay its eggs on. It lays eggs down south, and then those butterflies hatch, come further north, lay another brood, and then those butterflies, and maybe even their children, are the ones that actually make it all the way up to us in the north. It's an incredible thing, and yet the same butterflies that hatch out in our region will be able to make it all the way to Mexico. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It's actually an endangered phenomenon, and if we lose milkweed, we will not ever be able to have that whole phenomenon of that miraculous migration that the monarchs make. Now, I just said that the monarchs have a great PR system, and they do. Unfortunately, the rest of the insect world isn't quite up there with their PR. So what people don't realize is that this is actually true of most of our insects. Most insects are host-specific, some even more host-specific than monarchs. Monarchs can use any milkweed, anything in the Asclepias genus they can use. They can use Mexican milkweed, they can use common milkweed, they can use butterfly weed, they can use swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata. They can use all of those different milkweeds. Some butterflies, though, are really, really picky eaters. This is kind of the poster child for one of the picky eaters. The Carner blue butterfly is New York's only federally endangered butterfly. And one of the reasons that it's endangered is that its food supply is limited to this one also fairly rare flower, the eastern lupin, Lupinus perennis. That is not the same lupin as the lupin that many of you may be familiar with in your gardens, the Russell lupins and those hybrids, and the western lupin, Lupinus polyphyllus. Those lupins are actually toxic to the caterpillars of the Carner blue butterfly. And one doesn't really think that a butterfly could make a mistake because we think they're almost like supernatural, you know, they know their host plant. But mother butterfly can be confused between an eastern lupin and a western lupin, or even an eastern lupin and a Russell lupin. And they can lay their eggs on the wrong one. If they do that, the caterpillars will hatch out onto the plant, they will try to eat the leaves, and they will either starve to death or they will die because they are poisoned. But they do not thrive. And there are many other examples of this throughout the insect world, of insects that can really only use one plant or maybe a handful of plants, maybe 2 or 3 plants that are native to the region and that they co-evolved with. And the reason for that is because plants have a defense mechanism. Plants don't want to be eaten, so they have chemicals, and their leaves have chemicals that they express. And each leaf is different, and each plant is different, and each combination of chemicals, like chemical warfare between insects and plants. And so the insects kind of encourage the plants to come up with these different defenses. They become accustomed to one or more plants, but they cannot become accustomed to all of the different plant defenses. So they specialize. They specialize in one toxin that they can handle. And as many of you probably know, the monarchs actually use the toxin that's in the Asclepias to make themselves unpalatable to birds. And they use that toxin, and if a bird tries to eat a monarch, it will spit it right out again because it knows right away that it's a toxic thing. And in fact, that's why the other butterfly, the viceroy, mimics the monarch. And a lot of birds know better, and so they'll stay away from the viceroy too. They're fooled by that. So ultimately, this has implications for the entire food web, because these little predators right here, these are not the predators, but their parents are going to go out and seek out caterpillars and all kinds of tiny little insects. Because even a seed-eating or a berry-eating bird, when it's an adult, must have insect larvae as a baby at this stage. They will not grow on anything else. The exceptions to those are the water birds. Colonial water birds eat fish, and of course the raptors. But 96% of almost all of our songbirds are neotropical migrants. When they're being fed as babies, they're being fed tiny little insect protein. Even hummingbirds eat tiny little insects when they're babies. That's before they get to eat the nectar. Another reason to use native plants is that they're 4 times as likely to attract pollinators. Some pollinators are also host-specific, and they will actually, certain bees can only go to certain flowers, as strange as that may sound. Now that the honeybees are under threat from, that movie that we were talking about before, that sort of documents the problems that are going on with honeybees, it's become clear that we really need to rely more also on our native pollinators, because we can't just keep trucking honeybees around the country, which is actually what's done for some farm fields. And so in California, they've started, the agricultural extension people have started telling you to the farmers to plant rows of native plants along the edges of their farm fields, attracting the native pollinators, and then the native pollinators will spill out into the farm fields and pollinate the crops that they want to get pollinated. So the bottom line, and this is, I'm going through this very fast. Usually I take a whole hour to do this talk, but I wanted to just give you an intro. This is the bottom line. In order to have the plants and the animals surviving together, we need to have native plants in the environment. We need to add those plants back in because, as most of you know, we have taken a lot of exotics and put them into the landscape, some of which are escaping out into our wild areas and making them much more impoverished habitats for the insects and the wildlife that depend on them. Moving right along, so how do we do that? How do we take our formal landscapes, even our informal landscapes, how do we bring and incorporate native plants into plantings that most of us have already got fully established? From my own perspective, 18 years ago when we moved to Hastings-on-Hudson, we had a fully landscaped suburban garden, much like any other, full of exotic plants, some nice, some not so nice, some invasive. And it was a process of culling and adding to, and I'm going to talk about some of that and how we can also break out of some of the stereotypes that we have about using native plants in a strictly naturalistic form. So 100% is not a realistic solution. So when I say we should have native plant gardens, do I mean that you should tear out your most cherished lilacs and other plants that you've had for a long time and that are not really causing a problem? No. Most people will add more native plants to an existing garden. If you have, there are many plants that have been around in this area historically and that have not proven to be a problem. Lilacs is one example. Most of the roses, if they're hybrid roses, we know multiflora rose is a problem. We know that some of the other species roses can also be a problem, but the hybrids, the tea roses, are so heavily bred that most of them don't really have anything, any way of spreading. The Pieris japonica, I have a couple of really large examples of those in my own yard. They have never, no one has ever documented them escaping into any wild area. So there are plants that we can use that we can feel comfortable with. If you have a mature hybrid rhododendron, why would you yank that out? Evergreen azaleas don't seem to spread. There are plants that we can use, peonies, but there are plants that are a problem. Burning bush, if you have burning bush, if you have Japanese barberry. These are some plants that are still commonly found in older suburban landscapes that are a problem and that you really should prioritize for replacement. So talking just strictly from a design point of view, not an ecological point of view, but just strictly from a design point of view, all of our gardens will fall somewhere on a continuum from chaos on the one hand to control on the other hand. And you can see where my own personal bias is by the size of the two illustrations. I definitely do tend more towards chaos in my designs, but I can appreciate a good knot garden when I see one. But this is something that we really need to sort of put a damper on. All these extensively ridiculous lawns. This is a way of controlling our environment, but this is not a way of controlling our environment that is environmentally sound and can still be accommodated. I mean, you can take the whole controlling your environment to pretty ridiculous lengths. But this may surprise you, this picture here. This might look to most of us like the antithesis of a native plant landscape. But in fact, most of the plants making up that photograph are, with the exception of the grass lawn, are native. Those are very heavily sheared dwarf white spruces. White spruce, Picea glauca, is a native plant. Happens to be a stranger version of it than what we're used to. You wouldn't probably see these growing out in the wild, although someone did actually find the prototype in the wild. In the back we have some beautiful statuesque white pines. Those are native. So you see, this is just a style, and you can take native plants and put them into any style that you want. Here's another example, topiary. This is just a style. One of those topiaries is native and one of them is non-native. And from an ecological point of view, which would you choose? It's really kind of a no-brainer. If you have two plants that perform the same identical aesthetic function in your landscape, why wouldn't you choose the native one? Because that's going to actually, believe it or not, that is going to provide some actual habitat for some insect or some bird, more so than would the non-native.
Which one's native?
Guess. Nope, it's the one on the right. I actually do ask sometimes, and I usually get that response, and it's because it's just a little bit fuzzier, isn't it? And it's just a little bit wilder, but in fact, the really well-groomed one is the native.
What plant is that?
Well, that's a Chinese, that was a Chinese juniper, and this is the same. This is the one we were talking about before. That's the dwarf white spruce. It's just carved. It's just pruned in a particular manner, in a particular style. And now, speaking of style, here's a garden that's laid out in a very geometric format, and none of these plants, to my knowledge, are in fact native. But you could see how easy it would be, and as an exercise, we'll do it right now. We will substitute native plants for all of these different plantings. And so for the hedge in the background, we'll use inkberry. We'll take the inkberries and we'll carve them up, make them look like a nice rectangular hedge. The centerpiece, that beautiful tree in the center, we could make that a redbud. We could make it a dogwood. Anybody else want to throw out a suggestion? And the ground cover could be moss phlox. It could be pussy toes. It could be, there are so many, it could be tiarella. It could be, we have so many beautiful ground covers that could be used in those same geometric forms and would give a very similar look. And that's how easy it is to take a very formal design, using native plants, make it an ecologically sound and still formal design. Here are some particularly well-suited plants if you're doing that kind of formal look, if you want a little mini Versailles. Ilex glaber, as I've already said, can be sheared into almost any form. I sheared that one into a very nice round shape when it was very young because it was damaged. And actually it grew out in a perfectly round form, and it grew fairly slowly. So that was actually a good experiment, and I was able to find out that particular plant holds its shape very well once it's been sheared. Hibernica, in the middle, that is a common juniper. And we mostly see common juniper in the wild in New York State as kind of an irregularly shaped bush. But it actually grows in many different forms, and this particular one was chosen for its tight, very tight habit. You can see that that does not ever have to be sheared. It just grows that way. It just grows in that very perfect form. Over on the right, Woodwardii, that's Thuja occidentalis. That's our native arbor vitae, also known as northern Atlantic northern cedar. And then we have another cedar, but that's Atlantic white cedar. So the northern is just northern cedar, I guess. But arbor vitae is the most common name. There are more than 1,000 different varieties that are easily available in the nursery trade. It's one of the most plastic and easily bred of all of the conifers, heavily utilized all over Europe, and it's our own backyard native. If you drive through the Adirondacks, you'll see swamps full of towering, beautiful arborvitaes.
Can you just keep in mind deer when you're talking about these things, because I know I have, my deer.
The deer will eat arborvitae, yeah. Well, pretty soon in this region, we'll all have to have fences around our gardens, or our gardens will be limited to 5 or so plants. But we'll talk about deer a little bit later, maybe at the end. I'll take some questions about deer-proof and deer-proofing questions. So this particular black-eyed Susan is actually a very upright form. A lot of the times you'll see black-eyed Susans used in a more affluent form where it's mixed into a border and it has kind of a flow to it. This one is actually quite upright and tidy. Here's another dwarf conifer garden. This particular garden right here is completely deer-proof. All of those little dwarf cedars and white pines are completely deer-proof. Deer leave white pines alone, and they leave the spruces alone. They don't, well, the birch, actually the birch, I think they would probably nibble on the bottom leaves, but they haven't, for some reason they haven't touched that one. I'm not sure why. They do, yeah, they will definitely browse the understory of any birch that they find. We have so many birches up in the Catskills that the birches actually can outrun the deer. Yeah. Bald cypress, that's a deciduous conifer, used here in a formal park-like bosque setting. A bosque is simply an orchard planting of a deciduous tree that's not a fruit. Over on the left, you see the ferns are performing a certain function. They actually, because ferns grow up later in the season, they grow up to cover the lilies that are growing in those same beds that are now stalks. And so it's kind of a 1-2. First the lilies, and then the ferns come up and hide the remains of the stalks. Very nice use of the ferns. Here's some more bald cypresses. This would be a bald cypress allée. An allée is simply a long lane or drive that is formed a cover by the trees. And in this case, again, it's the bald cypresses are being used. This has a much more informal understory, though. You can see that there are shrubs underneath, it's heavily planted underneath, unlike the last one. This is a white pine allée. This is a garden called Innisfree in the Upper Hudson. Some of you have probably been to Innisfree. This is not the heavily gardened part of it. This is actually pretty much naturalistic. But I show it just to show how if you want a more formal effect, using fewer plants will give you that effect. Just using the ferns and the white pines gives you that sort of very soft and simple effect. Here's another example of an allée. If you're my height, which is 5'2", and you're walking down the center of Joe Pyeweed, which can get 7, 8, even 9 feet tall, it really has that feeling. And I thought this was a really useful and interesting application of the Joe Pyeweed to line an entire pathway through this particular section of the Connecticut Arboretum. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. This is, if you've ever looked at a landscape architecture textbook, any textbook will have a shot of this. It's a very famous use of tulip trees. Tulip trees are noted for their perfect stems. They're perfectly straight, regal, and almost branchless, up to very high, even 30 feet without a branch. And they do have that sort of columnar effect. So if you're looking to recreate Greek columns, which I think was the idea here, tulip trees are an excellent choice. Many of our trees have fastigiate or upwardly branching variations. And that means, fastigiate simply means that instead of the branches going out horizontally, they're basically going straight up into the air. What that gives you is a very tight silhouette. And these trees can be very useful in streetscapes, and you can also mask them for some very interesting effects like this here. This is our very own liquid ambar, which is turns beautiful scarlet in the fall. The star-shaped leaves, beautiful scarlet color. Sweet gum is the common name. And I wish I had a picture of this in the fall, because that would be quite stunning. But I like the way these are massed together, almost in a kind of a modernistic sort of effect, and certainly not all in a row, which could also be done. I mean, they would make nice row trees as well, or even a hedge. You could make a hedge out of them. On the other extreme, plant breeders have also been busy finding and breeding the dwarf versions of all of these species. So those of you who feel that you don't have the room for an actual full-size tree in your yard, you may actually be able to have some of these as dwarf trees. And they really make great additions to the landscape. You can see here the color of the sweet gum is starting to color up very nicely right now. Intensely scarlet when it's fully colored up. Moving out of the more formal and into something that I'd like to call the Asian styles, many gardens are heavily influenced by Japanese, Chinese, like Innisfree, that tradition. And it tends to be rather loose and flowing, and it's characterized by asymmetric branching patterns and the use of it's just not cookie cutter. So at the same time that a lot of Japanese maples and other Japanese trees are used in traditional landscapes like this, there are many natives that are also traditionally used, and many more natives could be used in the same way. Obviously, hemlocks, weeping hemlocks, are kind of a standard fixation in most of these gardens. The common juniper in the center there, that's gold cone. It's got those sort of goldish outline around the edges of it. And then that's the Juniperus horizontalis, probably Wiltonii, the blue rug juniper creeping over the edge there. All of those are native plants. I'm sure that they weren't trying to create a native plant garden, but you can see that really a lot of our native plants are very well attuned to that style. Here's another obvious example, another large weeping hemlock. And there is a dwarf white spruce, another form of it, which is that bun-shaped, which goes very nicely in some of those gardens and is also deer-proof. And my fixation with Japanese maples is that I have a lot of Japanese maples in our woodland area, which is a natural area park in Hastings. And they've just seeded themselves in. And the problem with Japanese maples is that they really are quite invasive. They are beautiful plants, I give you that, but they really will go everywhere. And I actually have a Japanese maple, but my husband won't let me cut it down. So I'm contributing to the problem, but I'm trying to find a solution for this problem. So I've been on the lookout for a native plant that could be a good substitute for a Japanese maple. And I thought I finally found one in this particular sweet gum, because it has those beautiful star-shaped leaves. And plant breeders could probably figure out a way to make them a little more filigrade. And I started pruning away at something called gumball. That's the name of this particular cultivated variety of sweet gum. It comes rounded, so you really have to clip at it. And I decided that it would probably have been better to try with a younger specimen and let it grow out a little bit. So it's a work in progress, but if any of you know of a plant that would do well, it's a native plant that would be a great substitute for Japanese maple, please let me know, because I'm definitely on the lookout. This is a beautiful, beautiful example of Waite's golden Virginia pine. This is a really, even straight species, open pollinated, regular old green Virginia pines are an excellent substitute for the Japanese black pines, a lot of which are actually getting diseased. Long Island has a real problem with their black pines, and so it's a good idea to start phasing them out. They were very overplanted at one point.